Hi, I'm Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio. Today I'm working on a new project. I'm replicating the appliques from a vintage 1930s quilt and making a baby quilt using some vintage feedsack fabrics. And I started by tracing the appliques on the vintage quilt using tracing paper and a pencil, and then I transferred that pattern onto freezer paper, and I made several copies of this, about 6 to 10 copies I believe. Once the copies are made, I cut those out, and then I press the freezer paper pattern onto the back side of the fabric, and then I cut them out using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once those are cut out, then I'll clip in the corners and in some of the curves to help ease that seam allowance as I'm pressing it under. Now the story behind this quilt is I have a friend, I'm making these quilts for her. She had a sack of feedsack fabrics that were her mother-in-law's, and she had made several sunbonnet Sue blocks that were also in that bag. I think there were 11, and she wanted a baby quilt for her great-granddaughter. So I used those original blocks and made a baby quilt for her. And then more grandbabies came along, so she gave me this bag of feed sacks again and asked me to make more baby quilts for her. So I made 2 additional sunbonnet Sue quilts, and then I made another one with puppy dog appliques, and I have this quilt and then 2 more to make. So we had quite a bit of feedsack fabrics in there, and I think we'll be able to get all those quilts made, adding a little bit of reproduction fabric as we go along. Now here I'm using spray starch in this little cup and a stencil brush, and I'm applying that to the seam allowance of the templates of the appliques, and using a hot dry iron, and I'm going to press that seam allowance under, holding that iron on there until that starch dries, and that'll keep that seam allowance in position. And you just have to be careful not to get your fingers in the way so that you don't burn them. But as I go along, I do half of the butterfly at a time. Otherwise that starch kind of dries up before I get to the other side. Now you notice the center of this butterfly is already on. I put those on before I positioned the applique onto the background fabric, and that is stitched down with a zigzag stitch and matching thread. And for the butterfly, I'm also using a zigzag stitch. It's fairly small, and some fabric or some thread that matches the background fabric, and I'm zigzagging around the edges of that applique. And the seam that you have pressed under, the template has been removed. There's no paper underneath there, and the seam still keeps its form with it, using that spray starch. And this was just a regular weight spray starch. It was not a heavy starch. It was just regular starch, and it works just fine. Now there are different stitches that you can use on your machine. You can use any decorative stitch that you have, and actually my preference is to use a blanket stitch and a contrasting thread, like a black thread, to go around appliques like this. But unfortunately I only have one machine with that blanket stitch on it, and that machine is out of commission at the moment, so I'm using this zigzag stitch on this quilt. And just trimming my threads, and that block will be done. Now for the setting, I'm using a straight setting, and I'm putting sashing between the blocks. And this fabric is a feedsack fabric. It was just a solid pink, and I had enough to put sashing between the blocks in the rows for this quilt. This quilt, the finished block size is 11.5 inches, and it has a 2-inch sashing, and the also has 2 borders, a 2-inch border and a 5-inch border. So the total size of this quilt will be 66 by 66 inches, and that's fairly large for a baby quilt, but these quilts that I'm making will last for these children. They'll be able to use those way into their childhood and hopefully be a keepsake for them when they get older. And here's the top with all the blocks completed with their sashings, and I think that turned out pretty well. The next step will be to add the inner borders, and I'm going to start at the top of the quilt and add a reproduction fabric. I didn't have enough of the feedsack fabric to make the inner border, so I am piecing some reproduction fabric here, and I'm just laying those two pieces at a right angle, right sides together, and then sewing diagonally down from the upper left corner to the bottom right corner. And then I'll trim off that little triangle here and leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I just use my scissors so I don't have to move away from my sewing machine. And then trimming off those little dog ears so that I'll have a nice straight piece of fabric here, and you'll see that as I unfold that. And then I'll press that seam open. So here's the inner border. I'm starting at the top of the quilt, and I'll sew that piece on, and then I'll sew the bottom border on, that inner border to the bottom of the quilt. I'll sew that on, and then I'll sew on the sides. Now this reproduction fabric, I bought this, probably back, trying to think, probably 1990, no, it probably 2005-ish, and I bought this in the town that my mother lives in. I was visiting her at the time, and we decided to hit the quilt shops, and I found that fabric, and I've used it in a couple of different quilts over the years. So save your scraps, they can come in handy sometime down the future. Now when you're replicating applique, you do have to watch copyright laws, and since this is a vintage quilt and it is a pattern that is in the public domain, there are no copyright issues here. So you do have to watch that. You don't want to be copying the applique from a modern quilt without purchasing the pattern from the designer. Now this is working on the outer border, and this is back to using the feedsack fabrics. And this piece was cut at 5.5 inches, so that'll give me a 5-inch border when we're done. And this is another pink fabric, so this is obviously a little girl's quilt. So here we have the finished top with all the borders on it, and then this will get machine quilted, and I'll have videos of that in the future. So that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, I hope you give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and thanks for watching.